God morgon! Welcome back to Atlant Insights. Today we're going to talk about the aspect of the topsoil and dating. The next video on the chronology series is going to be more about the chronology at large and how the other aspects of chronology, like for instance, calendar readings and astronomy and a few other things, how they all blend together into one cohesive chronology in Olof Rudbeck's work. So Olof Rudbeck, he was a scholar in the 17th century, but in those times chronology was a bit more discussed than it is today. Today chronology is kind of set in stone, right? It was really not that much of the case in the past. It was much more, you could come up with your own opinions, you could move things around a little bit, you could come up with your own mathematical calculations and so forth. And Olof Rudbeck was one of those people who actually did that and moved some things around. What he moved around the most compared to where it is today is that of Egypt. He claims Egypt is much younger than we say today. Today we have Egypt far in the past before all the other civilizations. Rudbeck says that is just not the case at all, that they are part of the other civilizations. But that is a part of the chronology series, which will be far into the future. Today we're going to talk about topsoil, which is probably the most fundamental aspect of the chronology. This is how Rudbeck says that this is kind of the nature's way of saying when civilizations started living on that land. And his topsoil dating is very different from today because he assumes short timelines, and we today assume long timelines, whereby interpretations of the topsoil growth rates is very different. I got inspired to do this because of David Vose's video, The Truth About the Tartarian Empire, wherein he talks about the rate of soil growth and whether this can be used as a dating method, and how it seemingly is kind of underused as a dating method. It seems like if you can determine the rate of soil growth, you should quite easily be able to determine the age of that soil, right? This is not really the case the way it is being studied today, which is in the long timelines. As I said, I will explain what I mean by that in the latter part of the presentation. Right now, I'm going to talk about Olof Rudbeck's interpretation of the topsoil, at least when it comes to how it is the rate of its growth in Scandinavia. Because this work, Atlant or Mannheim, which he wrote in between 1672 and 1702, is strictly about Scandinavia, which he claims is the Indo-European homeland. It's like the homeland of most of the Indo-European civilizations, all the way from Scandinavia down to North India. These are the Japhethites, and the island of Scandinavia is Atlantis, according to him. I say island because if you're new here, if you've been here, you know that Scandinavia was seen as an island in antiquity. And with Rudbeck's interpretation of the topsoil growth rate, you also get some geological interpretations, which argues for the flood. He believes that the topsoil is 4,000 years old, the same age as that of the biblical flood, while he says that the topsoil started growing after the flood. So he believes that the Atlantic culture is actually after the big biblical flood. This is quite different from today's Atlantis theories, which claim that it is an antediluvian, but it is after the deluge. So, how do you determine the rate of soil formation? First of all, it's specifically this soil that is being talked about, the topsoil. This is the soil where vegetation grows on this soil. And this is vegetation rotting and dust and so forth accumulating on the earth year by year. And the $1 million question is, of course, how fast does this happen? How fast does all the different things accumulate year by year? And the answer is, of course, very different depending on where you are, if it's tropical, if it's arid, if it's wet, or if it's dry, and so forth, depending on which layers underneath there are. That, of course, also determines the topsoil growth rate. There is really not one answer to this. David Vos, in his video, he found that when he asked the AI, it gave him 1 foot per year. And this might be true in the tropical areas or areas with a lot of vegetation. I, however, suspect that this might be too much even this, because this is 1,000 times more than the topsoil growth rate of Scandinavia. It's hard to imagine that there's almost 1,000-fold more vegetation in tropical areas than in Scandinavia, right? I am more on the low end of the spectrum, where the topsoil grows kind of slowly. At least when you follow Rudbeck's work and his reasoning, the topsoil actually grows about 1 foot per 1,000 years and not per year. So how he came to this conclusion is what we're going to look at now. Underneath the topsoil, there are layers, which are either in layers or blended. And they are bedrock, stones, gravel or pebble, rough and fine sand, or clay. These are underneath the topsoil. And Rudbeck says this about these layers under the topsoil in the first book on page 81. These layers are thrown on top of each other in lines in the same way as along seashores, where storms throw up different layers of sand and earth according to the direction of the wind. If one then digs through the sandbank, when the sea has calmed down, one can clearly see how each type of sand lies in layers on top of each other in lines. This can be clearly observed in all our sandbanks, just as in the earth itself. So he's saying that these lines in the sandbanks on the earth behave in the same way as the sand lines on the beaches. He's basically saying that these have been thrown here by water, by a flood. And in between these layers, there's never any topsoil. So these layers have not been formed slowly over time, over millennia, but must have been formed in one event, according to Rudbeck. Rudbeck also says that throughout Scandinavia, there is like a median thickness of this topsoil, which is 5.3 inches when it is untouched. On page 83, where the soil is even and neither eroded or supplied with new material, the topsoil layer seems to grow at the same pace over time. So this is in stark contrast with modern interpretations of the topsoil rate, as I said, because he assumes a young Earth when we today assume much older timelines. I have examined over 11,000 different locations and found that the soil layer has almost exactly the same thickness, with the differences so small that they are barely noticeable. I have also had this confirmed through others at several different locations. I have personally visited areas that have never been inhabited by humans and that have been very difficult to reach, among the mountains, cliffs, and boulders. Yet, I have found that the soil there has the same thickness as in other places where it has never been disturbed since the Great Flood. This natural soil layering seems to maintain a thickness of about 9 fingers width, which is about 5.3 inches. So, yes, here you can see that he tested 11,000 different locations, all in all, to come to this conclusion that the median thickness of the soil layer in Scandinavia, according to Rudbeck, that is 5.3 inches. And how quickly did it get to this thickness? He says that in 40 years, he could observe that the topsoil layer was thinner than a leaf. In sites he knew was 100 years old, he saw a tenth of an inch. In sites which he knew was about 1,000 years, he saw that there was 1.2 inches or 3 centimeters, whereby he concluded that those in 500 years should be 1.5 centimeters or 0.6 inches. So you can see here that it claims that it is 0.3 centimeters per 100 years, which times 5 is 1.5 centimeters, and times 10 is 3 centimeters, and 3 centimeters times 4 is 12. So he says that the soil grows 0.3 centimeters per year, or I'm sorry, per century. And he says that this soil grows at this steady rate all the time. This is not what is believed today, as I will get to. And as I said, he claims that the topsoil is on top of layers which behave in the same way as lines of sand on the beaches. And also that the topsoil is never beneath these layers below the topsoil, while those layers had to have been formed in one single event, while he believes that this was from a flood, that these layers under were formed. And he claims that the topsoil is 4,000 years old, and the biblical flood happened 4,000 years ago. So he believes that that is the flood that formed these lines underneath the topsoil. So test sites, he knew some places that were 100 years old. He doesn't report everything. I guess you have to remember that a few hundred years ago, conditions were a lot worse than today. They, of course, didn't have all the same technologies. Everything was much more expensive. Everything was much more time-consuming and laborious. So you basically had to do a lot more trade-offs than we do today. And one of these trade-offs he did, obviously, was to not include all of his research in his book. He just did not have the time. Even when he made one edition, he did not finish his fourth book before he died. And he probably would have written even more books had he lived longer. So trade-offs had to be made, and therefore he did not really publish, unfortunately, a lot of these test sites, which he claims to have dug through. But in test sites that were 100 years, he claimed to have found a 1/10 inch of topsoil, or 0.3 centimeters. That is in European. And then he also knew some sites that were at least not touched since the Christianization of Scandinavia, which was around the turn of the millennium, somewhere there. And one of those were the burial mounds of Gamla Uppsala. And if you're somewhat familiar with Scandinavian history, you might know that Uppsala, or Gamla Uppsala, Old Uppsala, was the pagan capital in Scandinavia before it became Christian. So he knew that they were at least from around this area. And when he dug the graves in here, the ones that were latest touched, he found that they had 1.2 inches of topsoil, which are these 1,000 years. So he came to the conclusion that they had not been touched in 1,000 years, which in his time lands it in about 600 to 700 CE. So this is when he dates these mounds that have been touched the last time. Here you see the Museum of Gamla Uppsala, and they have a video where they talk about Olof Rudbeck.
Hans teori var att mängden jord kunde påvisa hur gamla själva gravhögarna var. Och med den här metoden så daterar han gravhögarna till 600 till 1000 efter Kristus. Och det är ju inte allt för fel, för idag så daterar ju vi de här gravhögarna till 500-600-talet.
So they say that the burial mounds are from 500 to 600, so 100 years before, which is actually quite close. But they also say that Rudbeck says 600 to 1,000. And as I've shown here, he's actually much closer than that. He's in fact just 100 years off from today's estimation. In actual fact, quite close. Either way, they say that however close Rudbeck was to determining the correct age of these mounds, they basically say that he is correct by accident almost, because they say that all these other conclusions are so off. But then they say that he has this range of age when it's actually much more precise. So his method is actually quite close to the method of today. Other burial mounds he also knew had not been touched since the Christianization of Scandinavia around the turn of the millennium. And he found that they never had a thin layer of topsoil than 1.2 inches. So also these 1,000 years. So they were the last time touched during the same age as the largest burial mounds, around 600 to 700 CE. So Rudbeck claims that these are the youngest burial mounds. I would suspect that this goes quite starkly against what historians say today. I would venture to suggest, or guess, that they would say that is about the oldest that these are. The oldest burial mounds, according to Rudbeck, he talks about on page 91. In the area around Gamla Uppsala alone, within a radius of 1 mile, I have counted and examined over 12,370 such family mounds. So here you can see how close together these family mounds can be, why this number can be so large. And also, if you know anything about Olof Rudbeck, he was basically a polymath, like a genius, and all they did was work all the time for decades. Why I believe that this number, many believe that this number is exaggerated, and it might be, but it's also feasible when you think about who Olof Rudbeck was. He was basically a working maniac. He worked all the time. He continues, I doubt that there are so many remaining traces of ancient times and customs anywhere else in the world. This is a bold claim, of course, but in the 1600s in Sweden, imagine that these burial mounds were pretty much everywhere in Uppsala. There were thousands upon thousands of them everywhere, and they also had stone formations around them. And these are unfortunately pretty much all gone today. But these were everywhere in his time. Why he makes this claim. He continues, the very oldest of these family mounds, where the black soil has grown up to 4.1 to 4.7 inches, show with undeniable clarity that the kingdom of Sweden was inhabited as early as 200 years after the Great Flood, around the year 1800 or 1900 after the creation of the world. So that is around 2200 to 2100 BCE. This proof is more certain than all the legends from the Greeks, Latins, Egyptians, and Chaldeans. Here, no one can be misled by a writer's pen, a printer's letters, or a historian's loyalty, nor by any false process. It is nature itself that bears witness, and these family mounds stand there today, unchanged through time, ready to be examined by each and every one of us. So it's a bold claim, right? That he says that this is evidence, more strong evidence than the writings of the Greeks, the Latins, and the Egyptians. So this is something I'm going to examine more of in the future, this question of the topsoil growth rate. Here, Olof Rudbeck makes a strong claim for it being 1/10 of an inch about there each century in Scandinavia, and that it grows at a steady rate. That is the million-dollar question. Does it grow at a steady rate or not? Today, we're not saying that it grows at a steady rate. Today, we are saying that it stops growing after a while. Why dating in this method is not used today. And that depends on how old you believe that the parent soil is, right? So yes, this is a question that will be much more examined and researched by me in the future. This is like the opening the door to this topic. And as I said, there are several answers to the question of the rate of topsoil growth. There was one article I found which claims the same thing as Olof Rudbeck does, that it takes 1,000 years to make 1 inch of topsoil. But most do not claim this today. David Vos, in his video, when he asked AI about the rate of soil formation, he got the answer that in temperate and tropical climates, it is 1 to 3 inches per year, which, if you compare this to Olof Rudbeck's research, is 1,000 times more, or even 3,000 times more, which would mean that they would have a heck of a lot more vegetation, right? In thousands times more. Why either, yeah, so this is why this is a difficult topic, right? There are so many different answers, and it's difficult to know what is the correct answer. But they also say that in arid or semi-arid regions, it is much slower. Is it thousands times slower? Perhaps, I don't know. It seems to me far-fetched that it would be 1,000-folds times in differences, this topsoil growth rate. However, I don't know. This is really just posing questions at this point. Here is a very interesting study I found on the topsoil growth rate and determinations of it. This is in Russia. So the title of this is Rates of Soil Forming Processes in 3 Main Models of Pedogenesis. So pedogenesis is basically topsoil growth. That's what it means. So they say that according to the normal model, the rates of soil growth exponentially decrease with time, so that in 2,000 to 3,000 years after the beginning of soil growth, temporal changes in the soil properties become negligibly small, which is typical of soils in the steady state. So they say that after about 2,000 to 3,000 years, it reaches a kind of steady state, where as much soil comes in as goes out. They also say in the introduction that soil formation is uncertain, that dated surfaces suggest about 1,500 to 7,000 years to mature, and some say much slower, and some much faster, some even less than 100 years. So according to this study, David Vos's rate that he found on the AI, about 1 to 3 inches per year, even that would be too fast for even this study, which claims that the fastest scientists today claim is less than 100 years. It would take like 2 to 3 years to get the topsoil with the rate that David Vos has in his video. Again, this is just what I found with my research, and again, this is not any strong truth claims for anything. This is just me reflecting Olof Rudbeck's research, which I wanted to basically show David Vos because I think he could find this interesting, since this talks about the flood and so forth. I myself am also on the track of questioning the timeline and chronology, which is set up today, which Rudbeck kind of did in his time, but was also kind of Scalagerian in his research. So I don't know if his assumptions about the 4,000 years to the flood is actually correct. It might be shorter, even. I don't know. I'm still very open to interpretations, even Rudbeck's. Here is one problematization we could do, or basically just ask the question, opening up the discussion in today's modern research into the soil growth rate. And that is that of chronosequencing, which is basically just comparing soil sites which are similar in as many aspects as possible, but in age. And they help determining the soil formation rates. So this is what the study I found says about chronosequencing, that this information can be quantitatively estimated for the soils with an age of up to 2,000 to 3,000 years. And after this time, rates of soil processes decelerate, and the exact determination of their rates poses a serious challenge for researchers. They seemingly cannot come to any sure conclusions on this with today's models, with the models being that the parent soils are between 10,000 to 50,000 or 100 years old. So that is, of course, the old Earth, where you have to assume that soil accumulation significantly slows down into a dynamic equilibrium, as it is called, or a steady state, where soil leaves as fast as new comes in. And determining this seems to be very troublesome. There doesn't seem to be any good data on this. If you have young Earth, or that the parent soil is much younger, in Rudbeck's case about 4,000 years, then you pretty much have to assume that the overall soil growth is steady instead, right, with this model. But in this case, chronosequencing, or comparing similar sites with just different ages, it gives you actually quite easily interpretable data. If you can determine the rate, and then you measure the thickness, then you have the age. That is basically what Olof Rudbeck did, right, when he compared the different burial mounds and so forth. But in of course, a very simple way compared to how you would do it today. So in a young Earth, it's actually quite simple, but in old Earth, it is quite difficult. That does not mean that the old Earth model is wrong. I'm not saying that truth has to be simple or complicated. I'm just saying that it's much easier in the young Earth to determine the age of the soil. The money question is, of course, what is the natural behavior of soil? Does it eventually slow down into this dynamic equilibrium, or does it steadily grow each year indefinitely until something happens? And depending on what model you have, you will see either something like this or something like this. If the model being then how old you believe the parent soil is, either around here or around here. So is the slowing down or the steady growth rate a natural process or a modeling artifact? To what degree is the perceived natural soil formation a modeling artifact driven by assumptions of timelines? So this is basically me opening a question and a discussion into something very big, and this research is still a long way ahead to make any assumptions on my part. This is just a very interesting question to be had. So this is all I had for today. Thank you very much for listening if you came this far, and I hope to see you again soon.